I see your face in the sun, making days so very bright. I see your face in the moon, lighting up the darkest night. I see your face in each flower and in every drop of dew. Everywhere I look, there are you. I see you in the mountains with such silent majesty. I see you in the treetops and in birds that fly so free. I see you in the eyes of friends when they look back at me. Everywhere I look, there are you. Even when dark clouds do sometimes hide the sun, and your face seems hidden, and I feel so all alone, I still know that I'm your child, surrounded by your grace. Please keep me ever close to you and show your precious face. I see you in each step I take, in every place I may be, in every face before my eyes, in waves upon the sea, in each and every pleasure, and even in my pain. Oh, everywhere I look, there are you. I see you in my hopes and fears, and in my every song. I see you in my smiles and tears. To you I do belong. You're the soul within me, and the love within my heart. Everywhere I look, there are you. Yes, you're the soul within me, and the love within my heart. Everywhere I look, there are you. Yes, everywhere I look, there are you. There are you. There are you.
Om Asato Ma Sadagamaya Tamaso Maham Jyotirgamaya Mrityormam Amritam Gamaya Avir Maidhi Rudra Yate Dakshinam Mukha Te Namaham Pahinityam. Om, lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness unto light. Lead us from death to immortality, and reach us through and through ourselves, and evermore protect us from ignorance by thy sweet, compassionate face. So my subject this morning is the divinity of man. And we can begin by looking at this word divinity. It comes from an ancient Indo-European root, div, which means to shine. And we can trace it etymologically through different language systems. In English, we call it divinity, deity. In Latin, it becomes deus. In Sanskrit, deva. A deva is a god. And he's called a god because he is a shining being. And in ancient Vedic times, they used to worship the gods, the devas, the light sources. They didn't worship anthropomorphic gods. They worshipped light sources, like Agni, the god of fire, or Dios, the god of the dawn, or the lightning, Indra, or Chandra Devi, the moon, the shining planets. And of course, foremost among the gods is Surya Deva, the sun. And we can see why people used to worship the sun, the source of all light and heat and life on the earth. And if we think back to those ancient times, there are gods and goddesses who live in higher worlds. 7 worlds above, 7 below. And there's gross, and then there's subtle, and then there's causal. We live on the gross plane. But as we look up into the sky, and we think of God or gods, we look up into those subtle and causal level where the devas seem to dwell. And they seem to be far above us in their nature. And we regard them maybe somewhat like the peasants of ancient Britain used to regard the nobles of the British aristocracy, revered them as belonging almost to a higher order of being. And certainly it's true that the gods seem to have some powers which exceed our own. And that certainly we can say that they live on higher levels of the apartment building. They have a better view. They maybe have bigger quarters and a wider perspective. But we know, too, that just as we came to understand that those noblemen were really just, the peasants realized that the noblemen were really just men like ourselves, similarly to the gods. The gods are just men like ourselves, disembodied men who've died and who've gone to the heavenly worlds, that are invested with higher orders, higher responsibilities. serve cosmic functions. But they're really no different from us as mankind, because after all, we also are shining beings. And although we have a physical flesh and blood body, we know too that our mind is filled with light, our consciousness within. And just as the sun reflects itself in a drop of water, or in the pond, or in a lake, although the manifestation is different, it's the same sun, it's the same divinity, which is reflected in all beings. And, well, we don't feel that way. We don't feel like we are divine beings. We also don't treat our neighbors as if they are divine beings. And this is because we see through a glass darkly. The divinity of man, divinity means light. And light is a universal metaphor, a universal symbol for knowledge. Knowledge removes darkness. It removes ignorance. And instances of knowledge are just part of a larger knowledge, knowledge with a capital K. And knowledge is nothing but pure consciousness. And this is the teaching of the Vedanta philosophy, that in your true nature, you are pure consciousness. This is the axiom from which the whole philosophy is derived. Axiom means that there are certain entailments, there are certain corollaries to this axiom. If you are pure consciousness, then certainly you are not a physical, material, flesh and blood body that's born, grows old, and dies. And if you're pure consciousness, then certainly you are not the thoughts and the feelings and the memories that arise in the mind like waves in the lake of the mind, continuously changing. That is not our self. And certainly you're not the role that you play in the melodrama of life, nor are you the persona, the public person that you present yourself to be. Rather, the teaching is that you are the spirit. Now, the spirit is something, when you think of the word spirit, don't think about something which is kind of misty and foggy and mysterious and kind of like a hazy fog, or like a ghostly presence, a phenomena that may manifest itself in some psychic seance. This is not the spirit. The spirit is your own self-consciousness. And we feel today that the spirit, that is our self-consciousness, we feel ourself to be localized, to be existing in a limited space, to be finite beings, and characterized by name and form. My I consciousness appears to be limited. But the teaching of the Vedanta philosophy is that you are not limited. That in your true nature, you are infinite. You're not limited by time and space. You're not defined and localized by some set of grid point coordinates. You don't exist in some slice of space-time temporally. Rather, you are eternal. It's not as if you are some wave in an ocean in which there are many waves, and you're localized as one wave, but rather that you are the ocean itself. And you remember how in the life of Sri Ramakrishna, you remember how his very first vision of divinity, defining moment in his spiritual practice at the Kali temple, when he had almost given up hope and become mad with the longing to realize the divinity within. And he had that vision, which he later described as Asima Ananta Chaitana Jyoti Samudra. That is an infinite. What did he see? He saw an infinite, unbounded, conscious sea of light. That's what divinity is. And that sea of light, that ocean of consciousness, is not localized by nature. It's not finite. It's infinite. And the infinite is one only without a second. Ekam evadvatiyam. It's a technical term in the philosophy of non-dualism. One only without a second. That means there's infinite and infinite. There can't be two actual infinites. Because if there were two, then one would limit the other. So really there's only one actual infinite being. And within that being, that is yourself. That is God. That is all of reality. And everything is contained within the one. There's nothing outside of the one. The one is not lacking of anything. It's complete. It's full. We could say it is the whole. It contains everything. And therefore the natural state of the one is infinite peace and consciousness and bliss. So this is the doctrine of the divinity of man. Now this doctrine represents a very strong statement about the human nature. Human nature. Divinity of man, as a phrase, it seems to be almost contradictory, because when we think of divinity, we naturally think of something which is infinite and which is universal. And when we think of the of man part, we think of ourselves as small, as finite, as limited. And so how could the infinite be finite? It seems like a contradiction in terms, and yes, that's true. But the teaching of Vedanta is that there is a real and apparent man. The real man is infinite, is unbounded, pure consciousness. The apparent man is finite and limited, and we could call it that divinity reflected within our own mind and heart, that divinity that identifies with the body, the mind, and the intellect. We call it the self. It's the self with a small s. The real man is the self with a capital S. And, but really, they're both the same self. The analogy given in the Vedanta philosophy is that of a clay pot that's filled with water. And if you think of a large pot, there it is. That pot is kind of like our flesh and blood body. It's gross. The water symbolizes our interior mind. That's like the water. But the space within the pot, that is the pot space, that's our consciousness. And we can see that that pot space, although may feel, look at the clay of the pot and the water, may feel like it's identified with the pot. But we can see too that space, in its true nature, is just all relative. That space is, it cannot be divided. That the space within the pot and the space outside is the same unbroken space. It's only in our own mind and our own conceptualization that draws these limits and the lines about what is the inside and what's the outside. So you have a beautiful, open, wide open spaces. You go and you build your house there. You inside your house. You say, yeah, now I'm inside. You look there, oh, what's that? That's outside. But really there was no inside, there's no outside. From the point of view of the space, it remains the same. Similarly, it is with our nature. Now you may ask, well, how do you know that this is true? How do we know that this doctrine of the divinity of man is really true? How can we justify it? How do you know anything's true? Well, you have to justify it. Otherwise, it's not knowledge. So in Vedanta, there's three ways to prove something to ourselves. Three ways of proof about the ultimate reality. The Sanskrit words are Shruti, Yukti, and Anubhava. The first of those words is the Shruti. That means the scriptural texts, the Holy Scriptures. This is our first line of proof. Now, Vedanta, maybe you have to get a little bit used to this. The Vedanta philosophy is very textual. That is, it regards the Shruti. That means the Vedas, the most ancient religious scriptures in the world, are regarded as the ultimate authority in all matters of metaphysics and spirituality. That means that in all questions about our true nature, our soul, does the soul exist? Is there a God? What's the relation between our soul and God? Did God create the world? What's the relation between God and the world and ourself? Is there such a thing as the law of karma? Are there universal divine laws? All of these things are known to be true because they're revealed in Scripture. They cannot be known by sense perception. They cannot be known by reasoning. They can only be known by superconscious, direct perception. In ancient times, there were rishis and seers who did spiritual practices and who realized and to whom these truths were revealed. And these rishis are regarded as authorities on all matters spiritual. Why? Because they fulfilled certain conditions of adequacy, and because they exemplified certain standards of integrity. And therefore we can trust in the verbal testimony. It's called verbal testimony. How do we know most of what we know today? Our walking around knowledge, it's all verbal testimony. We've heard it from somebody who we regard as an authority. Similarly as here, there are authorities in this matter. And therefore in Vedanta, and in all orthodox schools of Vedanta, regard the Vedas, that is the Upanishads, that's what we call Vedanta, as these are the proof texts. These are the source of our knowledge. So that's number one. That's called Shruti. How do we know this is true, this doctrine of divinity of man? That's one reason, one avenue. We can study the teachings of the rishis and the seers. Now there's another way that we can establish the truth of this doctrine within our own mind and heart. That is, proof here means convincing evidence. Where can we get more convincing evidence that this doctrine of the real and the parent man is true? Well, we can use our own God-given reason. Now, everything in the world has an essence. The essence is what makes it what it is. If you ask someone, well, what is a tree? Well, we reply by describing its essence. Similarly as in man has an essence. And the essence of man is self-consciousness. The essence of man is self-consciousness, not just consciousness. Animals are conscious. We could say that in a way, maybe there's plants are conscious. But only man is self-conscious. Self-consciousness is the spark of divinity within us. Now, there are some belief systems who deny the existence of the self and who maintain that the self, that is myself, I talk about myself, that the self is just an idea. And in fact, it's a false idea. Just like if you're a narcissist, you believe, I'm the greatest person in the world. All right, well, that's an idea, but it's a false idea. Similarly, they say that this idea of the self is a false idea. Other philosophers maintain that this sense of having a self is an illusion. But we can contrast these belief systems with that of the Vedanta philosophy, which maintains that the self of man is an a priori first principle. It's a universal a priori fact of reality. And it's an axiom. That means it's a first principle from which everything else is derived. And in fact, if we don't have that first principle, everything in the world becomes incoherent. But some belief systems are comfortable with some degree of incoherence, so it doesn't matter. Vedanta teaches that you are the self. That is, that you are pure consciousness. And that we have to remain clear, in order to remain clear about our true nature, we have to always be using our God-given reason and our power of discrimination. If we stop thinking, see, it's thinking that makes us human. Only human beings think. If you stop thinking, then you regress into your animal nature. As soon as we stop thinking and discriminating, then we naturally begin to slip into the false notion that we are, I don't know, maybe an amorphous energy field. We're just a big energy field. And body and mind and soul and spirit are just kind of frequencies of energy. It's all one big blob. And we begin to think that we are composite beings. They were a body. We have a body. We are a mind. We have a body. We have a soul. We have a spirit. These are all somehow a composite. But if you think about that, that can't be reasonable. It can't be true. If the soul is pure consciousness, it could not be the physical flesh and blood body. It couldn't be a physical, material object. After all, our physical body is always undergoing changes. And ourself, we have a sense of unchanging personal identity. We're the same identical person as we were as far back as we can remember. So too, a material thing is inert. All material things, all objects in Vedanta philosophy are inert. That is, they're just matter. They are prakriti. They're nature. They're a form of nature. Similarly, this with the body is just, it's a phenomena of nature. It's not conscious. The self, the conscious self, is the witness of the body, and thus it couldn't be the body. And the body, after all, when it grows old and dies, we know ourselves, well, if you believe in reincarnation, your soul and your spirit journeys on to higher worlds and is reborn again, maybe a different body. In the Katha Upanishad, 2nd chapter, you remember it compares the flesh and blood body with a suit of clothes. And just as we wear that suit of clothes during the day, but at night we take off those clothes and we sleep soundly. And then when we get up in the morning, we put on another suit of clothes that are new. Similarly is with the physical body. It cannot be our conscious self. That's just kind of reasoning. And similarly it is with the mind. The mind is always changing. It is inert. We can be clearly aware of the functions of our mind. That is our sense perception, our perception, our conception, our process of thinking and imagination. We can observe those when we do introspection. We can become aware of those different functions of our mind. They are not ourselves. They're different from the observer. Similarly, we can become aware of the contents of our mind, sensations, percepts, thoughts, feelings, memories. These are all objects of our awareness. They cannot be ourself. So like that, reasoning in this way, this is our second method here of arriving at convincing evidence. Reasoning in this way, we come to the conclusion that is by using the logic of discrimination, we come to the inevitable conclusion that it would be unreasonable to think that I am a physical, psychological energy being. I'm the witness of those objects. That's a reasonable conclusion. And as you know, the great Sherlock Holmes, well, he was a master of deduction. And when he would investigate some crime in order to arrive at the truth, the right explanation, he used to say that when you eliminate the impossible, then whatever remains, however improbable, must be the case. Similarly, it is in Vedanta. Vedanta, there are 6 pramanas. One of those pramanas is called arthapatti. Arthapatti. That means Sherlock Holmes reasoning. That means Devadatta is very fat. But we observe that he does not eat during the day. Therefore, we can conclude that he eats at night. That's knowledge. Arthapatti is a means of knowledge. Now we have knowledge. So how do we know? How do you know anything? How do you know it's true? You have to use the pramana. If you employ a pramana, then the pramana, that is a means of attaining knowledge, it will give you knowledge. So it seems like this is reasoning. How does reasoning go? And we can continue, we can carry reasoning further. Because we can reason about the 3 states, waking, the dream, and the deep sleep state. We can reason that at night, we lay down to sleep, and what happens? We ourself, our consciousness, withdraws from the physical body into the energy body. and then it withdraws from the energy body into the mental body, and then it withdraws from the mental body into the intelligence body, and then it withdraws from the intelligence body into the bliss body. That is, the gross body is enfolded into the subtle body, and the subtle body folds up into the causal body. And all that's left is yourself. There's no mind, there's no awareness of body, of anything physical, of mind. All it is aware is of yourself. You're kind of reduced to the essence. And just as if you were to take a pot of vegetables and some meat and vegetables, and you were to put them into a pot and you were to begin to cook them down into a stew, and then you were to keep cooking that stew, it becomes a soup, and you keep cooking that soup, and maybe it becomes a more refined extract, and you boil that down, it becomes like a bouillon cube. That's yourself. Deep sleep, you're like a bouillon cube. All that remains. Now, what is that state? That's a state here. Well, we can't do any analysis in deep sleep because there's no mind. But when we wake up, we can do a phenomenological analysis about what happened because we remember what happened. And the fact is, we recognize at that time that in fact, one thing we know about that state is we were conscious. How amazing. Contrary to conventional wisdom, we were not unconscious. We were conscious. And in addition to that, at that time, we had a sense of great peace and stillness. In Sanskrit, it's called ananda. That means bliss. Bliss just means peace. The peace of awareness, of consciousness. And that's our essence. That's our real self. It's the most real. Why? Because it's all that remains. The other things are less real because they're dependent on this. This doesn't change. So that's reasoning. It's called shruti, yukti, that's reasoning. Now let's look at the third proof, which is called anubhava. Your own direct experience. Now Vedanta maintains this doctrine of the divinity of man, established revealed by the scriptures, realized by the rishis and the seers. It's not a dogma. It stands to reason. It is clear to reason. And when we hear this idea that I am what is your true nature, that I am an infinite being, that is, I have infinite potential, certainly everyone in the world has a positive affirmational response to that idea. That is, there's something in our intuition that tells us, even though we may argue ourselves out of it, something that tells us it's true. We know it's true. We feel it's true. But then we know, too, that we haven't realized that it's true. We haven't had immediate, direct knowledge that it's true. That's the third proof that we need in order to be convinced. And that's why in Vedanta, all of the different that Vedanta philosophy is a philosophy of life. It requires, it's not enough to believe, and to know the truth and to reason the truth out. We have to experience the truth for ourselves, and that means that we have to do yoga practice. We have to do spiritual practice. We have to change our way of thinking and being. Now we see through a glass darkly. We've got to remove that mud from the glass so that we see clearly. That's what yoga practice, spiritual practice is. Now we're like a bird on a lower branch. We look up in the top branches. There's a bird up at the top branch. We can kind of see it. We know that it's there. But we know, too, that we're far distant from that higher bird. And this goes back to the most ancient times, Shvetashvatara Upanishad, Mundaka Upanishad in the 5th chapter. Dvasuparda Sayuja Sakaya Samanam Vriksham Parishasvajate Taur Anya Pippalam Swadvat Tyanashnad Nanyo Abhichakashiti. Thousands of years ago, they were discussing the same thing we're discussing this morning. And they give an analogy there in the Upanishad that our condition is like this. We're not realized. How do we get realized? Well, it says there that they're at a picture in a forest. There is a tree. And on the tree, there are two birds. One is a bird which is seated on the highest branches. And the other is a bird who's on the lower branches. The bird on the higher branches is sitting calm, quietly. He's the witness of the whole forest. And the lower bird, however, is completely distracted by the sweet and bitter fruits on the branches. Now that tree symbolizes our body. That is the tree of life, tree of knowledge. The higher bird is our higher self, our divinity. The lower bird is our lower self. It's the jivatma. And now we're conditioned today is that we are distracted by the sweet and the bitter fruits. So what does the bird do? Well, finally, he finds a sweet fruit and he enjoys it. But then he gets a particularly bitter fruit. And that distaste, he looks up to the higher bird sitting calmly, majestically, looking on without eating. And the lower bird thinks, yes, I'd like to be in that state. And so thinking, he hops up a few branches. He does a little spiritual practice. But then he gets distracted again. Sweet fruits, bitter fruits, disappointed, looks up, sees that higher bird, gets inspired, hops up 1 or 2 branches. And like this, time passes, and the bird gradually hops up higher and higher until the last branch he looks up, and there that bird is right in his presence, and the two merge together, and they become one. And there I realized that there was really only one bird after all. And you know how in a forest, if you're walking through a forest, maybe the breeze is blowing the leaves of the trees, that sometimes the movement of those leaves and the sunshine create illusions in the leaves of the trees. Similarly here, there's an illusion of a lower bird, a higher bird. There's really only one bird, and that is our true self. That is the divinity of man. And that is the goal of our spiritual practice.
From the one has come the many, in the many shines the one. Of all the forms there are not any that have not come from the one. Smaller than the smallest, greater than the greatest, the light beyond all darkness, the love within our hearts. From the stillness of the mountains, in vast skies of brilliant blues, in ancient worlds and modern cities, that wondrous light of light shines through. Brighter than the brightest, higher than the highest, deeper than the deepest, the love within our hearts. Across this world are many people, so many creatures great and small. We are all children of the Mother. She is the one who made us all. Beauty of all beauty, yet beyond both time and space, still dwelling in each moment, bestowing on us her grace. From the one has come the many, in the many shines the one. Of all the forms there are not any that have not come from the one. Smaller than the smallest, greater than the greatest, the light beyond all darkness, the love within our hearts. The light beyond all darkness, the love within our hearts.
The subject next Sunday is Real ID, Vedanta Perspective. And Swami Vedarupananda will speak. Om Dyo Ho Shantihi, Antariksha Hum Shantihi, Prithivi Hi Shantihi, Apa Shantihi, Oshadaya Shantihi, Vanaspataya Shantihi, Vishwe Deva Shantihi, Brahma Shantihi, Saravam Shantihi, Shantireva Shantihi, Same Shantiredhi, Om Shantihi, Shantihi, Shantihi. Om, peace is in heaven, peace is on the earth, peace is in the sky and in the waters. The herbs and plants and trees are full of peace. The gods are peaceful. May this eternal universal peace enter our souls and beings. Om, peace, peace, peace be unto us all.